Today we're going to talk about rhombuses, rectangles, and squares. Lots of new properties today, so get ready. If you remember, our 5 ways to show that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram is number 1, the opposite sides are congruent. Number 2, the opposite angles are congruent. Number 3, opposite sides were parallel. Number 4, diagonals bisected each other. And if we remember our last one, number 5, is if one pair of opposite sides was parallel and congruent, then it was a parallelogram. Okay, we're going to get into some special parallelograms right now. Okay, these are our 3 special parallelograms. All of them still have properties of parallelograms, but they also have some other properties that we're going to have to talk about. First one is a rhombus, and that has 4 congruent sides. That's all we know, is that their sides are congruent, and then the properties of parallelograms also. A rectangle has 4 right angles, and a square has 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. Okay, so if I have a rhombus right here, okay, and it tells me that PQ is 6, if we look at what a rhombus has 4 congruent sides. So if we look at this, all my sides are going to be congruent. So this is going to be 6, this is going to be 6, and SP will be 6. Okay. If I have a diagram, in this diagram, ABCD is a rectangle. Okay. So we know that a rectangle is also a parallelogram. So opposite sides are congruent. So AD would be 5 and AB would be 8. We also know that when we talked about properties of rectangles, it has 4 right angles. So therefore angle A is 90 degrees, B is 90 degrees, D is 90 degrees, and C is 90 degrees. Okay, so now if we flip to the next slide, it kind of gives us a trickle down of what our properties are going to be. I like to go from the bottom up, saying that the square shares all of the properties that rhombuses and rectangles do and that parallelograms do. Okay, a rhombus is going to have all the properties that a parallelogram does, plus its 4 congruent sides. A rectangle is also going to have all the same properties as a parallelogram, plus it's got the 4 90-degree angles. So now we've got to talk about lots of new properties. Okay, if I have a rhombus, and it's going to be really important to have these properties in front of you when you do your assignment today, because when I'm talking about properties of rhombuses, now I have 90-degree angles at my diagonals. Okay, so my diagonals are going to be perpendicular. So these 4 angles right here are all going to be 90 degrees. Okay, they also bisect opposite angles. So if I have my diagonal right here, it bisects this angle and it bisects this angle over here. When I'm talking about a rectangle, okay, my diagonals are going to be congruent. So AC is going to be congruent to BD. And this is where we were a little bit confused when it was just a regular parallelogram. Doesn't necessarily mean that they were congruent unless it is a rectangle or a square. Okay, so if I have a rhombus and this is X, okay, we also know that since opposite angles bisect each other, that since this is 60 right here, ooh, yikes, I don't know what's wrong. All right, this is 60 right here. Kind of hard to read because my pen went crazy. So this angle right here is 120, which makes this whole angle 60. So if that whole angle is 60 and this gets bisected, that means X is going to be 30 right there. It's going to be half of that angle. So when we move here, now we're really talking about properties. We know that X, our diagonals of a rhombus, are perpendicular. So X is going to be 90 degrees. This is where your properties really come in handy. Okay, our diagonals are congruent. So if this is 12, X is also going to be 12. Okay, and if I have a square, my angles are 90 degrees, and if these bisect each other, which they do, X is going to be 45 degrees. Okay, lots of confusing properties that you really need to concentrate on. Okay, if I have this four-sided figure, okay, when I nailed these things together, doesn't tell me anything about the angles yet. It just tells me that opposite sides are congruent. Therefore, the only thing that I can say that this is a parallelogram. Okay. If my diagonals are 7, 4 and 7, 2, it's asking, is it a rectangle? Well, we know that in a rectangle, the diagonals have to be congruent. Since these have different measures, it has to be a no. Okay, let's talk about properties. What has 4 right angles? Well, we know that a square has 4 right angles, and a rectangle also has 4 right angles. So those are going to be the 2 of them that have 4 right angles. Opposite sides are congruent. Well, that's a property of a parallelogram, and since all of these figures are parallelograms, that holds true for every single one of them. 4 congruent sides, we know that a rhombus has 4 congruent sides and that a square has 4 congruent sides. Okay. Another property is that diagonals are perpendicular. That is true in a rhombus because all 4 sides are congruent. If we know about a square, we also know that all 4 sides are congruent in a square. So the properties of a rhombus also hold true for a square. We know that diagonals bisect each other in a parallelogram, and since all 4 of these figures are parallelograms, the diagonals bisect each other in all 4 of them. The diagonals are congruent. The only thing we talked about the diagonals being congruent in is a rectangle. Okay? Well, in a rectangle, the only thing it says about a rectangle is that it has 4 right angles, correct? Well, what else has 4 right angles? A square. So technically a square is a special rectangle, so that also holds true for a square. Okay, and we know this is a rectangle, so when I'm looking for this angle right here, we know that angle is what? It's 90 degrees. So we go 4y minus 2 equals 90, and we get y equals 22. Okay, here opposite sides are congruent, so we have 7x plus 4 is going to be equal to 3x plus 24. I went ahead and distributed that. Move my 3x over, I get 4x equals 20, and my x is going to equal 5. Okay, this one gets a little bit more complicated. Okay, we have all 4 sides congruent, so we know that it's a rhombus. Okay, so therefore if it's a rhombus, angle 4 is going to be 90 degrees. Okay, that one's the easy one. We know that this we know that this angle is 68, so the whole angle is going to be 68 times 2, which is 136. So this whole angle is 136. That makes this entire angle 136. Okay, therefore angle 2 is going to be 68, and angle 3 has to be 68, because we know that they bisect each other over, or the opposite angles get bisected by the diagonals. Okay, so let's figure out what 1 is then. This is 136. Therefore, to figure out 1, I've got to take 180 minus 136, and this entire angle is 44, which makes angle 1 half of that, which is 22 degrees. Okay, again, really concentrating on what all of our properties are and being able to put all of them together. Okay, now we have a figure. We know that it's a rhombus because it tells us up here that it's a rhombus. So BEC is this angle right here. We know that the diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular. Therefore, we know 3x minus 15 equals 90. Okay, so we have to add our 15 and we divide by our 3, and x equals 35. Okay, So now I think it really helps if we decide what angles we're talking about here. We're talking about ADE, which is this angle right here, and CBE, which is this angle right here. Okay, we know that the diagonals are going to bisect each opposite angle, so therefore we can say 5y minus 8 equals 3y plus 24. Therefore, 2y equals 32, and y is going to give us 16. Okay. Then when we're talking angles, we're going BAD, which is that whole angle right there, and ABC, which is this angle right here. Those do what? Since it's a parallelogram, those two angles add up to 180. So we've got to set that up as 4w plus 14 plus 2w plus 10 equals our 180. So that gives us 6w plus 24 equals 180. So we can subtract our 24 and get 156, divide by our 6, and our w is going to equal 26. Okay, lots of stuff to learn there. Okay, same thing here. We have angles that are next to each other, so consecutive angles add up to 180. So our 7x, oops, this should be a minus 28 plus 10x minus 13 is going to give us our 180. So 17x minus 41 equals 180. So 17x equals 221. We divide by our 17, and we're going to get x is equal to 13. Okay, so the main things that we really talked about today is when you go back to your list of properties, these properties right here are very important, plus our 5 ways to find whether or not it's a parallelogram. Okay, so the opposite sides being parallel, our opposite sides being congruent, our diagonals bisecting each other, okay, and our supplementary angles that are right next to each other. All very important things to remember today to be able to get your worksheet done. Okay, so today your worksheets, okay, not quite as simple as the last 2 days, is going to be on page 32 and 33.